The last barrel of neutralized effluvium settled into its cradle with a wet, final squelch. I straightened up, my spine screaming in protest against the suit's rigid support frame. 6 weeks. 6 weeks wading through the toxic soup they called the acid bath, a flooded sublevel of the Kronos orbital refinery that had sprung a leak in its primary coolant line. The pay was lucrative, enough to clear my debts and put a down payment on a decent habitat block back on Titan. All I had to do was survive the job. Now, standing here, coated in a film of iridescent slime, with the job finally, mercifully done, survival felt not just possible, but imminent. A grim smile pulled at my lips, unseen inside my helmet. "Last one, Marek," I grunted into the comm, my voice a tinny rasp in my own ears. "Cycling the airlock now. Have that credit chit warmed up for me." The reply came back crackling with static and amusement. "Don't spend it all on synthale and bad company, Leo. Airlock sequence initiated. See you on the clean side." Relief washed over me. A physical wave that made the 200 kilos of the environmental suit feel a little lighter. I lumbered toward the decontamination arch, my heavy boots leaving deep prints in the corrosive muck. The airlock door was a perfect circle of salvation, its edges glowing with a soft blue operational light. I stepped onto the grated platform, and the massive steel iris hissed shut behind me, sealing the acid bath away. For a moment, there was only the sound of my own breathing, a steady rhythm of recycled air. Then, jets of steam and chemical cleanser blasted the suit from every angle, the roar a welcome song of progress. My thoughts were already on the credits, on a real meal, not the nutrient paste I'd been living on a bunk that didn't smell of ozone and mildew. The decon cycle finished with a final, conclusive hiss. A green light illuminated the control panel next to the inner door. The last step. Get the helmet off. I reached up with my gauntleted hands, my movements clumsy but practiced, and gripped the twin release latches on the collar ring. I twisted. They didn't budge. I frowned, readjusting my grip and putting more force into it. Still nothing. The metal felt fused, unyielding. "Marek," I said, a flicker of irritation in my voice. "My collar ring seized. The decon must have gummed it up." Static. "Say again, Leo? You're breaking up." "The latches," I repeated, grunting as I threw my full weight into the effort. "They're stuck." I pulled until my shoulder screamed, but the seal was absolute. Panic, cold and unwelcome, began to prickle at the back of my neck. I'd been in cheap, second-hand suits before, worn seals, glitchy readouts, sure, but I'd never been sealed in. This was different. This was a deep space suit I'd bought from a guy who knew a guy, a hefty discount for a lightly used piece of kit. A corner cut, but a necessary one. I abandoned the latches and tried to get my fingers under the edge of the helmet, searching for any give. My glove snagged on something, not metal, a seam. A seam that wasn't supposed to be there. And then, as my fingers traced the strange, rubbery line, a sudden, blindingly sharp pain erupted on the side of my neck. It was a vicious, deep prick, like a large-gauge needle being driven straight into my carotid. I cried out, a strangled gasp, and recoiled, my hand flying to my neck. But there was nothing there but the smooth, unyielding inner lining of the suit's collar. No needle, no mechanism. just the lingering, venomous sting, and the sudden, terrifying sensation of something cold and thin beginning to spread beneath my skin. The unspoken was always a secret. The pain in my neck receded from a sharp spike to a pulsing, alien throb. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the sudden, unnatural silence of the airlock. "Marek!" I shouted, my voice cracking with rising panic. "Marek, get this door open! Something's wrong with the suit!" The comm was dead. Not static, not a bad connection, just a flat, lifeless void. He'd cut the channel. Standard procedure post-decon. Standard procedure that was now a death sentence. A new kind of terror took hold, a primal fear of being trapped, of being sealed in a tomb. I abandoned all attempts at finesse. My gauntleted fist slammed against the helmet's thick faceplate. It wasn't the ringing crack of metal I expected, but a dull, fleshy thud. The impact didn't even jar my head. It was like punching a side of beef. The material of the suit seemed to absorb the blow. I recoiled, staring at my glove. I hammered it again and again, each impact met with the same sickening organic give. This wasn't metal and polymer. It felt alive. My breath hitched, fogging the inside of the faceplate. Through the condensation, I could see my reflection, a distorted, wide-eyed ghost trapped behind reinforced plasteel. Or what was supposed to be plasteel. A low hum vibrated up through the soles of my boots, not from the airlock machinery, but from the suit itself. It was a bass thrum, subtle and deep, like the purr of some massive, sleeping predator. I felt it against my skin, a constant, living resonance that ran from my ankles to my scalp. Then the sensation spreading from my neck intensified. The initial needle prick had been the epicenter of a new cartography being drawn across my body. It was a web of ice-cold lines, branching out from the puncture point, down my clavicle, over my shoulder, and beginning to snake its way up toward my jaw. I twisted my head, trying to see it, trying to understand it, but I was a prisoner in the control room, unable to see the prison itself. It felt like tendrils, microscopic and invasive, were weaving themselves into my own capillary network. A second, parasitic circulatory system being laid directly on top of my own. I wasn't wearing the suit anymore. It was wearing me. Desperation clawed at my throat. I turned to the wall of the airlock, thick-plated durasteel, and threw myself against it, leading with my helmet. The impact should have broken my neck. It should have cracked the faceplate and left me gasping for air in a sterile chamber. Instead, there was that same repellent, soft thud. The suit cushioned the blow entirely. My body was fine. The suit was fine. But my mind was splintering. I was wrapped in a second skin, a layer of biomatter masquerading as equipment, and it had just sunk its teeth into me. I pushed off the wall and stumbled back, my hands roaming over the suit's surface, feeling the strange, supple texture that had replaced the hard shell I knew. It was warm now, flush with my own body heat. A suffocating dread settled in my chest, heavy and cold. The locks hadn't jammed. They weren't meant to open. This wasn't a malfunction. It was a function. Through the thick, reinforced glass of the observation window, I saw him, Marek. He was leaning back in his chair, a mug of steaming calf in one hand, looking at me with an expression of profound annoyance. My heart leaped. He hadn't left. He could see me. Hope, sharp and desperate, flooded my veins. I waved my arms wildly, pointing frantically at my helmet, my throat, anything to communicate the nightmarish reality of my situation. I could see his mouth move, his brows furrowed in irritation. Of course, he couldn't hear me. The comm was dead, and the airlock was soundproof. To him, I must look like a lunatic, or worse, an entitled worker throwing a tantrum. In my head, I screamed his name, pleaded with him. "Look closer, you idiot! Look at my face! See the panic!" But all he saw was an employee refusing to exit the decon chamber. His face hardened. He gestured dismissively at the airlock, a clear get-out motion. When I didn't move, when I couldn't move, couldn't open the helmet, couldn't explain, his jaw tightened. He jabbed a finger toward the control panel on his desk. My internal monologue became a raw, desperate prayer. "Don't do it, Marek, don't you dare do it!" I slammed my fists against the inner door, the dull thuds echoing inside my skull, a useless, pathetic protest. Marek spoke into his own headset, likely to someone in sight control. His words were invisible to me, but their meaning became horribly clear a moment later. A new light flickered to life on the airlock's control panel. Not green for clear, but a sickly, ominous amber. Above the inner door, a stenciled sign I had ignored 100 times before now glowed with terrifying significance. "Quarantine protocol engaged." My blood ran cold. Quarantine, the last resort measure for a contaminant breach or a psycho worker. A full facility lockdown of a specific zone. No one in, no one out. It was a one-way ticket to being forgotten about for a full cycle, maybe longer. "No," I whispered, the sound swallowed by the helmet. I shook my head, my eyes wide, pleading with a man who had already passed judgment. I mouthed the words, "I'm trapped," hoping against hope he might understand. He didn't. He saw defiance. With a final, disgusted curse that I could read clear as day on his lips, Marek slapped a large red-covered switch on his console. An alarm, muffled and distant, blared somewhere in the main refinery. A new sound joined the low thrum of the suit, the heavy, grinding groan of protesting metal. My only way out, the inner airlock door, was being reinforced. A secondary blast door, a meter-thick slab of solid steel, began to slide down from the ceiling, obscuring my view of Marek and the clean, safe world he inhabited. The sliver of light from the control room vanished inch by inch, a closing eye on my entire life. It sealed with a deafening, final clang that shook the very foundations of the chamber. And then, silence. A profound, tomb-like silence, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breaths and the soft, organic hum of the prison now fused to my skin. Marek hadn't just cut the comms. He'd buried me alive. The amber quarantine light cast long, distorted shadows across the tiny airlock. My initial frenzy of terror subsided, replaced by the chilling clarity of a man whose clock was now officially ticking. The suit's life support was robust, designed for hostile extravehicular activity, but it wasn't infinite. The readout on my HUD was glitching, the oxygen percentage flickering between 98% and an unreadable jumble of symbols. I couldn't trust it. I had hours, maybe a day, before the recycled air turned stale, then toxic. I had to understand what this thing was. Knowledge was the only weapon I had left. The blast door was impenetrable, a monument to corporate indifference. That left one other way out of the airlock, back into the acid bath. The thought made my stomach churn, but it was the only option. With a deep, shuddering breath, I turned and activated the outer door control. The steel iris groaned open, reintroducing me to the familiar chemical stench and the sickly green glow of the sludge. My plan was simple, born of desperation. Get to a terminal, any terminal, and try to learn what I was wearing. The zone's main control room was submerged, but a secondary maintenance station was located on a raised gantry just 20 meters in. Wading through the vicious, corrosive goo felt different this time. Before, it was a job. Now, it was a trespass. The suit moved with an unnerving ease, the thrum against my skin a constant reminder of the entity I was carrying. The feeling of the cold, internal webbing had spread further, a lattice of invisible filaments now encompassing my entire torso. I could feel it pulsing softly, in time with my own heartbeat. It was learning me. I reached the gantry and hauled myself up, metal groaning under the suit's weight. The maintenance terminal was still active, its screen casting a lonely blue light in the oppressive gloom. My gauntleted fingers were clumsy on the keypad, but the adrenaline coursing through me sharpened my focus. There was no company name on the suit, no brand I recognized, just a series of stamped serial numbers on the wrist plate. I keyed them in, my breath held tight in my chest. Searching. The machine whirred. For a moment, I prayed it would come back with a simple recall notice, a design flaw, a wiring schematic I could use to short the damn thing out. Entry found. Cross-reference active. Project Chrysalis. My blood turned to ice. A restricted file, flagged with the logo of a rival corporation, a company notorious for its illegal bioweapon research. The access required a higher clearance, but this terminal was a masternode, its security protocols corroded by neglect. A few simple overrides and I was in. The file that loaded onto the screen was not a schematic. It was a dissection report. Pages of data scrolled by, filled with biological terms I barely understood, accompanied by horrifying animated diagrams of a multi-stage life form. The text was stark, clinical. Specimen 7, Symbiotic Bioprotective Carapace. I scanned the words, my horror mounting with each line. Stage 1, Dormancy. Simulates standard deep environment suit functions, high resilience to physical and chemical damage. My hammering on the helmet, the decon cycle. It had felt like nothing to the suit. Then came the final, soul-crushing paragraph. Stage 2, Host Integration. Triggered by sustained proximity to designated spawning ground or through manual neurostimulus. Parasitic tendrils establish connection with host's primary nervous system. Unit ceases to function as protection and becomes a chrysalis, guiding the bonded host to the nearest suitable spawning environment for metamorphic completion. Host viability is secondary. Warning: integration is irreversible. My eyes shot to the flickering oxygen reading on my HUD. It wasn't a glitch. The suit was deliberately feeding me corrupted data. Below the warning, a single, horrifyingly simple directive was listed. Current objective: navigate host to spawning ground prime. The room swam before my eyes. This wasn't a suit. It was a coffin on autopilot, and it had just been given its destination. Reading that file was like a light being switched on in a room full of monsters. Before, the suit had been a passive cage. Now, understanding its purpose had somehow alerted it to my awareness. The shift was immediate and terrifying. The subtle organic thrumming against my skin intensified, graduating from a background hum to a palpable, inquisitive vibration. The cold, web-like network beneath my flesh tightened, a fisherman's net pulling taut around its catch. The suit knew that I knew. I pushed myself away from the terminal, a strangled gasp escaping my lips. I had to get away, put distance between myself and that terrible knowledge. My leg moved to step back, but my right foot stayed planted, rooted to the gantry floor, as if welded in place. A tremor ran up my calf, a muscular spasm that wasn't my own. I looked down, my mind screaming the command to move, to run, but my body refused. The suit was holding me there. The gentle probing was over. The puppet master was beginning to pull the strings. The silent, violent war erupted within my own skin. I threw all my willpower into lifting my foot, and with a guttural roar, I managed to break the invisible bind, stumbling backward. The moment of triumph was short-lived. The suit countered, sending a jolt through my left arm, causing it to jerk upwards, fingers splayed. It felt like a powerful electric shock combined with a muscle cramp from hell. It wasn't just resisting me, it was experimenting, testing its connection, finding the paths of least resistance in my own nervous system. It wanted me to go deeper into the facility, away from the airlock, toward the core. I could feel the impulse, a non-verbal command layered beneath my own thoughts. Go forward, go down. My own survival instinct screamed the opposite. Go back, go to the door, try to break it. I turned, fighting the invisible current that was trying to steer my body, and forced myself to take a step toward the sludge-filled main floor, back toward the airlock. Each movement was a battle. My leg felt like it was wading through setting concrete. A sudden sharp tug on my spine arched my back, pulling me to a halt. Tendrils I couldn't see but could acutely feel were coiled around my vertebrae, asserting their dominance. It was an intimate violation. An enemy burrowed inside my own flesh, hijacking the very signals my brain sent to my limbs. "No," I grunted through clenched teeth, sweat beading on my forehead and trickling down my temples inside the helmet. "This is my body, my body." I summoned every ounce of strength and defiance I possessed. I took another lurching, awkward step, and another. The suit fought back harder. It began to subtly alter my balance, making me list to one side, trying to trip me, to make me fall in the direction it wanted me to go. It sent sharp, needle-like pains into my joints when I moved against its will, a punishment for my disobedience. This wasn't just a struggle for escape anymore. It was a fight for my own autonomy, a war for the inches of flesh and bone I had always called my own. Every twitch, every step, every breath was now a contested territory, and I was losing ground fast. My own limbs were becoming the enemy's weapons, and the battlefield was my own soul. The battle for control was a grinding, agonizing process. I was a rower pulling against a monstrous current, my muscles burning, my mind fraying with the constant effort. The suit wanted me to descend a specific service ladder that led to the facility's core filtration systems, its spawning ground. My every instinct, every fiber of my being screamed to resist. During a moment of furious struggle, my flailing arm knocked against a wall-mounted schematic panel, causing a faded, grimy map of the sublevel to flicker to life. And there, through the grime and the static, I saw it. A symbol I recognized from my training. Chemical Storage Bay 3, Organic Waste Disposal. Hope, fierce and desperate, flared in my chest. Organic waste disposal. On this refinery, that meant one thing: CX9. A hyper-corrosive solvent so volatile it was used to dissolve damn near anything biological that went where it shouldn't. It was industrial-grade poison, capable of melting through reinforced polymers and flesh with equal, terrifying efficiency. If anything could destroy this parasitic monstrosity I was wearing, it was CX9. The storage bay was in the opposite direction of where the suit was hurting me, but it was on the same level. It was a chance. It might be my only chance. "All right, you son of a bitch," I gasped, my voice a ragged whisper. "You want to fight? Let's fight." I stopped trying to go back toward the airlock. It was a feint. Letting the suit think it was winning, I allowed it to pivot my body toward the service ladder. I could feel its internal pressure ease slightly, the coercive jolts lessening. It thought I was giving in. As my foot reached the top rung of the ladder, instead of stepping down, I threw my entire body weight to the left, using the ladder for leverage. The suit was caught off guard for a split second. A wave of agony shot up my spine as it tried to compensate, but my momentum was too great. I crashed into the grimy wall of the corridor, spinning myself around. Now I was facing the right way. Now the chemical bay was just 30 meters down the hall. The suit's response was immediate and furious. It wasn't just pushing anymore, it was actively trying to cripple me. My knee buckled as it fired a nerve signal to seize up my quad. I fell to one knee, crying out in pain, but used my arms to drag myself forward, scraping my gauntlets along the grated floor. "Get up, Leo." The inner voice was the only thing that was still truly mine. I rose, my legs shaking, my body a war zone. Each step was a monumental victory. 20 meters, 10, 5. The entrance to the storage bay was a simple, pressure-sealed doorway. I slammed my hand against the access panel, and the door hissed open, revealing a cavernous room filled with vats and storage tanks. And there it was, right in the center, a massive cylindrical tank with CX9 solvent stenciled in faded yellow letters. Above it, a network of pipes culminating in a large red emergency release valve designed for flooding the containment floor in case of a catastrophic spill. It was perfect. If I could get under that valve and open it, the suit would be drenched. It would be burned off me. It might scar me for life, give me chemical burns that would never heal, but I would be free. I would be me again. Hope surged through me, a potent drug that momentarily deadened the pain. With the last reserves of my strength, I wrestled control of my legs, stumbling and crawling my way across the bay until I was standing directly beneath the release valve, my salvation just inches above my head. I reached up with a trembling, rebellious hand. My body was broken, but for the first time in hours, my spirit wasn't. The time would only end. My gloved fingertips brushed against the cold, painted metal of the emergency release valve. A fraction of a second. That was how close I was to salvation. That fraction of a second was all the suit needed. I was so focused on the prize, on the hope of a chemical baptism that would burn this thing off me, that I didn't register its final devastating counterattack until it was too late. It wasn't a push or a jolt, it was a detonation. A silent, internal explosion of absolute control. An agony I could never have imagined erupted from the base of my spine. It was a white-hot, blinding nova of pure pain that overloaded every circuit in my brain. My vision turned to static, my breath was stolen from my lungs, and a scream tore from my throat, unheard inside the helmet. The constricting sensation of the suit intensified 1,000-fold. It was no longer a cage, it was a boa constrictor, and it was crushing me. My muscles locked, my bones creaked under the strain, and my body was paralyzed, frozen in place with my arm outstretched toward the valve. Through the shrieking static of my nervous system, I felt a new horror. From the inner lining of the suit, the parts that were pressed tightest against my back, my chest, and my limbs, came a horrific new sensation. It was a million tiny, sharp vibrations, like a swarm of hornets buzzing against my skin. And then they burst through. Hundreds, maybe thousands of microscopic filaments, impossibly sharp and monofilament thin, erupted from the suit's interior. They pierced my flesh without resistance, burrowing deep into my body with a singular, terrifying purpose. I felt them slide past muscle, around bone, seeking out the major pathways of my nervous system. They found my spinal cord, my brachial plexus, every core nerve cluster that allowed my brain to command my body. The agony was so profound, so complete, that I blacked out for a moment. When my consciousness sputtered back into existence, the world had changed. The pain had subsided, replaced by a chilling, profound numbness. I was still standing, my arm was still outstretched, but it was no longer my arm. I could feel everything. The weight of my limbs, the temperature of the recycled air on my face, the beating of my own frantic heart, but I couldn't control any of it. My connection to the controls had been severed. I was a ghost, a helpless spectator trapped behind the eyes of my own body. The suit had bypassed the brute force puppet show and plugged itself directly into my hardware. It was no longer fighting me for control. It had seized the means of production. Powerless and screaming in the silent prison of my own skull, I watched in abject horror as my own hand, moved with a smooth, fluid grace that I could no longer command. The fingers that had been reaching for the release valve now curled around a secondary lever right next to it. It was a safety lock. With a calm, deliberate motion, its hand twisted the lever a full 90 degrees. A heavy, metallic thunk echoed in the storage bay. The emergency valve was now locked shut, sealed against any attempt to open it. My last hope was extinguished, not by the monster, but by the hands of the man it now wore like a glove. The suit paused, holding my body perfectly still for a moment, as if savoring its victory, letting the totality of my defeat sink into the terrified, conscious mind it had so surgically isolated. The voice was listening. The body was growing. The end was near. The moment the lock clicked shut, a strange and terrible calm washed over me. The pain was gone. The frantic struggle for control was over. I had lost. The battle for my body was a settled affair. I was cargo, a passenger in a walking corpse, being chauffeured to a fate I couldn't even comprehend. The suit, now in absolute and uncontested command, lowered my arm and turned my body with an unnerving, mechanical precision. It began to walk out of the chemical storage bay, its footsteps, my footsteps, steady and purposeful. It was marching me back toward the gantry, toward the service ladder that led down into the guts of the refinery, toward its spawning ground. In the silent cage of my mind, something shifted. The terror didn't vanish, but it crystallized into something else. Rage. A cold, pure, diamond-hard rage. It couldn't have my body, not really. This shell of flesh and bone was just a vehicle. But my mind, my thoughts, my memories, my defiance, those were still mine, locked in a box it couldn't open. And in that box was a weapon the suit couldn't possibly understand. Knowledge. I wasn't a soldier or a scientist. I was a dock worker, a grease monkey, a maintenance grunt who'd had spent the better part of a decade crawling through the veins and arteries of industrial facilities just like this one. I knew their weaknesses. I knew their temperamental quirks, their safety overrides, the precise points where a system under strain would fail not just catastrophically, but apocalyptically. The suit needed me. It needed this body to carry it. But just as importantly, it needed this facility intact to serve as its nest. My body was the key, and the refinery was the lock. It intended to use my hand to open the door to its future. I would use my mind to slam it shut forever. A new plan began to form, a scorched earth strategy of mutual destruction. If I couldn't save myself, I would sure as hell make sure this parasitic horror didn't get to propagate. My mind raced through schematics I'd memorized, through safety lectures I'd slept through the greasy, hands-on experience of fixing these very systems. The primary waste filtration pump. It was the heart of the refinery's lower levels, a colossal piece of machinery responsible for processing and neutralizing thousands of gallons of toxic sludge per minute. It operated under immense pressure, governed by a complex network of thermal regulators and pressure sensors. If those sensors were to, say, receive false readings, if they were told the pressure was dangerously low when it was, in fact, critically high, they would work to increase the pressure, disabling the safety governors in a desperate attempt to compensate. It would turn the pump into a multi-ton fragmentation bomb. The blast would be immense. It would vaporize the core, rupture the coolant lines, and trigger a chain reaction that would annihilate the entire sublevel. It would destroy the spawning ground, the suit, and the body it had stolen from me. It was suicide, but it was also victory. The suit marched me onward, oblivious to the silent rebellion brewing in its host. Let it have my muscles. Let it have my nerves. I had my mind, and I had a plan. My fear was gone, replaced by a grim, resolute purpose. I was no longer a victim being led to slaughter. I was a bomb, walking myself to the heart of the enemy's camp, and my mind was on the detonator. The voice was breaking, just as they thought they had hope. As my body was piloted down the rusted rungs of the service ladder, my mind was already at work. The suit's connection to my nervous system was a one-way street. It could send commands out, but it wasn't reading my thoughts. That was its mistake. However, it had integrated on a deeper level than just nerves. It had woven itself into the suit's own native systems, using them as a bridge. The suit's comms, its diagnostic tools, its environmental sensors, it had co-opted them all. And that was my way in. I was a ghost in my own shell, but a ghost with root access. The comlink, though muted to the outside world, was still active, still connected to the facility's internal network. The suit was using it to monitor ambient conditions, to navigate. But any link, no matter how secure, can be exploited. I began to think, not in words, but in code. Simple commands, disguised as diagnostic pings. It was like learning to wiggle a finger after a stroke. The connection was tenuous, requiring immense concentration. My first attempt was just to send a meaningless burst of data through the comm. A flicker of acknowledgement came back from the network hub. I was in. As my feet touched the flooded floor of the lower level, I began my silent, invisible war. While my legs sloshed through the foul sludge with eerie, deliberate purpose, my mind was a flurry of activity. I pictured the facility's network architecture, a glowing web in my imagination. The filtration pump's control system was on a shielded sub-network, but I knew the back doors. Command: reroute power relay 7B to auxiliary systems. The command was wrapped in what would look like a routine status update from my suit's power cell. I sent it. Somewhere deep in the facility, a junction box silently clicked over. The first piece was in place. The suit didn't notice. It was too focused on its primary objective, on piloting my body through the maze of drowned corridors. It marched me past a bank of pressure monitors, their screens glowing green. Command: access pressure sensor subroutine. Modify data feed for pump 11A. Value equals -40% of actual. I cloaked this one in an environmental data packet. Air temperature, toxicity levels, routine bullshit. I sent the altered data packet into the system. On the screen I had just passed, the pressure readings for the primary pump would now be showing a steady, safe level, even as the real pressure began to climb from the rerouted power. The safety alarms would never sound. The tension was excruciating. It was a race against my own body. The suit was taking me on the most direct path to the core, and I was on a desperate, clandestine scavenger hunt through the facility's code, laying a trail of digital breadcrumbs that would lead to Armageddon. With every step my body took, I had to execute another piece of the puzzle. I disabled thermal alerts, spoofed coolant flow data, and, one by one, took every single safety protocol offline. My mind was a blur of code and consequence, while my body was a calm, relentless automaton marching ever forward. A strange duality took hold. I felt the cold ooze of the sludge seeping around my boots. I saw the corroded walls of the corridor slide by, but my true self was somewhere else entirely, a disembodied consciousness frantically cutting wires and setting timers in a digital space. The suit could feel the physical world, but I was the only one who could feel the building pressure, the rising temperature, the silent scream of a complex machine being methodically driven to tear itself apart. The plot was about to unravel. We arrived. The suit guided my body into a vast, cavernous chamber at the very heart of the facility. The air here was different, thick, humid, and pulsing with a low, visceral thrum that dwarfed the hum of the suit. This was the source. This was the spawning ground. It was more horrifying than I could have imagined. Sprawling from a ruptured coolant conduit, a massive, pulsating biomass covered the chamber floor. It was a tumor on the station's soul, a tapestry of veined, translucent flesh glowing with a soft, internal bioluminescence. Its surface writhed and shifted like 1,000 things breathing just beneath the skin. The sight was a violation of physics, a biological nightmare thriving in a place of sterile steel and toxic waste. The suit's objective was horribly clear. It was a seed, and this was the fertile ground it had sought. I could feel a change in the suit itself. The tendrils embedded in my flesh resonated with the biomass, a call and response on a frequency I could only feel as a deep, sickening vibration. The suit was eager. It forced my body to wade into the chamber, my boots sinking into the soft, yielding edge of the mass. A shudder went through me that was not my own, a feeling of homecoming. The suit piloted my body to the center of the grotesque garden, and then, with a horrifying, reverential slowness, it forced my knees to bend. It was making me kneel, preparing to merge my body, the chrysalis, with this larger organism, to complete its life cycle. My mind, however, was miles away at the filtration pump. Every trap was set. Every safety was disabled. The pressure had been building for minutes, a titanic, silent force contained only by straining bolts and groaning steel. All that was left was the final push. Command: execute final pump overload. Override all manual safeties. Full power. I wrapped the command in the suit's most basic, most constant data stream, its own IFF, identify friend or foe signal, a constant ping that said, I am here, I am safe. I sent it. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the universe broke. The low thrum of the spawning ground was instantly swallowed by a piercing, high-frequency shriek from deep within the facility's walls. Red alarm lights, finally breaking through my silent lockdown, flashed to life, bathing the writhing chamber in strobes of crimson. The suit froze. For the first time, its control over my body faltered. I felt its shock, its confusion, its sudden dawning realization of my betrayal. The tendrils in my spine writhed and burned as it tried to sever my mental connection to the comms, to understand what had happened. It was a frantic, desperate surge of alien panic, but it was too late. I held the connection open with a final, monumental act of will, a silent scream of defiance against the parasite. You don't get to win. From the direction of the pump room came a sound I will never forget. The sound of a god clearing his throat. A deep, impossible groan of tortured metal giving way, followed by a concussive roar that wasn't sound, but pure pressure. The floor buckled, the walls of the chamber split open. The biomass around me screamed, a psychic shriek of agony as the shockwave hit, and then the world erupted in a cataclysm of fire and force. The last thing I saw through my helmet was a wave of incandescent, white-hot energy vaporizing the monstrous flesh before it slammed into me, and everything went black. Consciousness returned, not as a gradual awakening, but as a violent, brutal summoning. One moment, I was in the silent void of oblivion. The next, I was drowning. My lungs burned, and I choked on acrid, chemically tainted water. My body was a constellation of pure, screaming pain. Instinct took over. I flailed, my limbs heavy and unresponsive, until one hand broke the surface. I gasped, sucking in a lungful of scorched, superheated air that was almost as suffocating as the water. The explosion had ripped a hole in the sublevel, and the blast had hurled me into a reservoir of emergency fire-suppressant coolant. It had saved me from being incinerated, but it had flash-boiled in the initial moments of the blast. I was alive, but I had been cooked. My eyes fluttered open. The cavernous chamber was gone, replaced by a twisted hellscape of glowing molten metal and raging fires. The air shrieked with the sound of collapsing structures and venting steam. Something was wrong. My breathing was ragged and shallow, my chest constricted. I was still trapped. The helmet, the damn helmet, was still on. But it was different now. The thrum was gone. The sense of an alien presence coiled in my nervous system had vanished. There was only me, alone. I reached up with a trembling, cooked hand and touched the helmet. The surface was no longer smooth and supple. It was a blackened, brittle husk. Chunks of it crumbled away under my touch like charcoal. The living components of the symbiote had been boiled away, leaving only the charred, inert frame. It was just a piece of dead equipment again. A surge of primal, desperate adrenaline shot through me, overriding the pain. I was so close. I jammed my burned fingers under the collar ring. The seals, which had once felt fused by an organic will, were now just warped and melted plastic. I pulled. Agony tore through my shoulders and neck, but the seal gave with a sharp crack. I tore at it, grunting, crying out, shredding my gloves and the skin underneath. I didn't care. The final latch broke. With a surge of strength I didn't know I possessed, I ripped the fused helmet from my head and threw it away. It clattered against a piece of twisted metal and sank beneath the foul water. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I gasped real air. It was toxic and tasted of ash, but it was mine. It was freedom. I looked down at myself. My body was a canvas of absolute horror. The suit hung from me in blackened, melted tatters. Where it had burned away, my skin was a ruin of angry red burns and weeping blisters. Worse, much worse, were the places where the suit had fully integrated. Deep, bleeding wounds, almost surgical in their precision, covered my arms, my torso, and my back, marking every spot where the suit's internal tendrils had been violently torn from my flesh by the force of the blast. I was free, but I was ripped open, flayed by my own salvation. Alive, but only just, floating in the ruins of my victory. The voice was about to burst at a harsh price. The weeks that followed were a blur of antiseptic smells, hushed medical jargon, and the dull, persistent throb of a body meticulously being put back together. They had found me half dead in the coolant reservoir, the lone survivor of what the corporation officially called a catastrophic reactor overload. They hailed me as a hero, the man who had inexplicably remained at his post and manually triggered the emergency coolant flush, sacrificing himself to prevent the entire refinery from going critical. They gave me a medal and a pension that would make me wealthy beyond my wildest dreams. They never asked about the suit. Its remnants had been conveniently vaporized in the accident. I healed. Skin grafts covered the worst of the burns, nutrient drips rebuilt my atrophied muscles, and a litany of painkillers kept the worst of the agony at bay. Eventually, the day came when the bandages were removed for the last time. I stood before a mirror in my sterile recovery room, seeing my new self for the first time. The face was mine, but older, haunted. My body was a patchwork quilt of pale, new skin and puckered, angry scars. I looked like a map of a war I had barely survived. But it was when I looked at my arms that the true, permanent cost became clear. Beneath the shiny, artificial layer of grafted skin, something else remained. It wasn't a scar, not in the traditional sense. It was a faint, dark, web-like pattern, like the ghost of a spider web trapped under glass. A complex, branching network that mirrored the path of my own veins. It was the tracks left behind by the burrowing filaments, a permanent tattoo of my violation, etched into my very sinew. The doctors had no explanation for it. They called it subdermal scar tissue and post-traumatic pigmentation, meaningless words to paper over a reality they couldn't comprehend. But I knew what it was. It was the cage, or the memory of it, baked into my flesh. I slowly raised my right hand, looking at its reflection. It was my hand again. I willed it to close, and it obeyed instantly. My fingers curled into a fist, the new skin pulling tight over the knuckles. And then I felt it. A flicker, a twitch, deep within the muscle of my forearm, a sensation that didn't belong to me. It wasn't a spasm from nerve damage. I knew what that felt like. This was different. It was an echo, a phantom command from a puppet master who was long dead. A sickening, familiar coil of intent that bloomed and vanished in the space of a heartbeat. My breath hitched. I closed my eyes, but I couldn't escape the feeling. I had won. I had survived. I was free. But a part of the parasite, a ghost of its control, a muscle memory of its will, had been left behind, burned into my nervous system. I would carry it forever. I opened my eyes and looked at my reflection again, at the man who had bought his life at the cost of his own body. He had escaped the prison, but a piece of the bars would always be with him, a permanent, phantom twitch to remind him that for a time he had been nothing more than a cage.